and putting. Okay. We need to stop putting that carbon in the crust, from the crust into the atmosphere. And we are now at a point where we not only need to decarbonize, but we also need to start taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so they wrote in their executive summary and in multiple places, all pathways, and by pathways, they mean actions and things that we're going to be doing, all pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with limited or no overshoot project the use of carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, on the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons carbon dioxide over the 21st century. This CDR would be used to compensate for residual emissions and in most cases achieve net negative emissions to return global warming to a 1.5 degree Celsius following a peak. And this is with really high confidence. So a lot of scientists around the world are very confident that we now have put too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to keep temperatures below 1.5. If we're lucky, we'll keep them below 2. And we need to start pulling some of this carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, along with decarbonizing our energy systems. And so while I was chasing 3-year-olds in the pandemic and not thinking, I was thinking about plants mostly, but mostly the pandemic, this announcement comes out. And what happened was this upswelling, especially in the United States, of these corporate net zero commitments. And they all said, and this is really led in the United States because a lot of our counterparts in Europe and Australia, where we do have some form of compliance markets. But in the US, everyone said, okay, now we're really going to get serious as corporations and corporate firms on this. And so this figure over here is just showing corporate commitments towards net zero pathways. That net zero means net zero carbon emissions, usually by 2030 or 2050, all kind of guided by this IPCC guidance. And this figure right here is from South Pole, but it's just showing this is sort of a typical pathway that a corporate firm might take of reducing its emissions. And I'll just point out that the green here are these residual emissions. So we're not just going to be able to decarbonize immediately. And so we may need to offset some of our emissions with carbon avoidance projects, or later on with carbon removal projects to continue drawing down carbon dioxide. And so the question then is, well, where can we put all this carbon dioxide that we've put into the atmosphere? Because we're not going to turn it back into fossil fuels because that takes millions and millions of years. But it turns out that our ecosystems are these really dynamic carbon storage facilities, and they do a lot of carbon storage. And so folks have now started looking at ecosystems as a potential place to take this atmospheric carbon dioxide and put it back into ecosystems. And so these blue words right here, plants and soils and oceans, those are the places where we can put carbon. Those are our carbon stocks here. But these red arrows going up and down, those are fluxes. That means that even though we can put carbon into these ecosystems and we can take atmospheric carbon, mostly through plants in the process of photosynthesis or critters in the ocean who also photosynthesize, and we can store it into these ecosystems, there's all these fluxes. And it's a very complicated ecosystem where we have respiration, including plants respire a little bit of carbon dioxide, our soils respire carbon dioxide. When we change what the plants are doing on the land, or we change the acidity of the ocean, we get lots of losses. And so these are not simple systems for holding on to our carbon dioxide. And so we basically have two options if we want to use ecosystems to store carbon dioxide. The first is reducing ecosystem carbon loss. These are sometimes termed avoided emissions. And what we mean by that is we need to stop deforesting. We need to stop land use change. We need to protect these ecosystems and allow them to do what they do, which is absorb carbon dioxide. And how do we do that? Well, there's a whole suite of different actions, ranging from protecting these ecosystems, so conserving them, not developing, not paving them over, to managing them in different ways that a lot of folks here have a lot of good experience doing. This is from the Nature Conservancy, managing timberlands, croplands, and grazing lands better. And there's a lot of different activities and practices that sort of fit within that better that some of the folks up here can chat a little bit about. The other option we have of storing carbon in our ecosystems is increasing ecosystem carbon gains. And these are what are termed negative emissions. So those are really pulling down more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than the ecosystems would if we just left them alone. And these are even more challenging ecologically to predict. They're challenging to manage, and they're a little bit more challenging to convince folks that we are actively doing this. And again, how do we do this? Well, we can manage our lands better. Managing does both. And I think this is why negative and avoided emissions, if folks want to chat about this a little bit more, become very conflicted when we're talking in ecosystem services, because it's very hard to trace a single carbon dioxide molecule and say, that one was avoided, but this one was definitely negatively removed. But we can also do a lot of restoration, and we just heard about restoration and wetland banking. And so wetlands actually create a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And so when we restore wetlands or we plant new forests, we are then taking up negative emissions. And those are why some of these projects are seen as sort of more likely to be negative emissions or more likely to be additional in drawing down carbon dioxide. And so the question of today that we've already heard in a couple of these talks is, well, how do we pay for these ecosystem management projects? And this, again, is a question that has sort of pervaded through decades and through time. And that is where the carbon credits ecosystem comes in as a new way to pay for some of these projects. But this time, what we're going to pay for are tons of carbon dioxide. And so the goal generally in these projects is to take one of these activities, land management activities, to count the carbon dioxide molecules, which are not like a barrel of apples because we cannot see them. We have to model them usually. Our data is usually not as good as, going to pick an apple, but put them into, barrels of tons of carbon dioxide and then sell them to all these folks who would like to buy them to offset some of their residual emissions or to help contribute to the drawdown of climate change. And so there's a lot of things that we expect from these barrels of carbon dioxide. And these are all words that you will hear in the carbon market that we can chat a little bit about more today. But this is what we want out of our barrel of carbon dioxide. We want it permanently stored in ecosystems. We want it to be durable. That's really challenging, remember, because we have all these fluxes. These ecosystems are naturally fluxing carbon dioxide all the time. We want it to be additional to what would have happened without the initial financing. So we don't want to pay for something. If you were going to plant a tree, we don't want to go pay you to plant that tree that you were already going to plant. We want to pay you to plant a new tree. We want them accurately measured, reported, and verified. And I will say here as an ecologist who spent a lot of time measuring plants and measuring carbon a little bit in soils, that ecologists were maybe caught a little flat-footed in really being able to do this well at scale. So across space and across time. And so this accurately measuring, reporting, and verifying is very challenging. And it also requires disciplines other than ecology. We need to be talking to political scientists and economists and lots of other folks. We don't want our systems to be leaky, meaning if we protect some trees over here from cutting, we don't want the person to go next door and cut the trees because we need timber. So we don't want leakage. We never want them to be double counted. We don't want, multiple people. And this actually becomes really tricky when we start talking about jurisdictions and countries that are offering credits and projects within countries that are also offering credits. The accounting systems aren't necessarily lined up for that. And finally, we want these projects to be equitable and just. We want to make sure that payments are getting to the people who deserve the payments. And we want to make sure that the places where we put these projects are benefiting equally and justly benefiting all people and not leading to more injustice within the environmental system. And so we're asking a lot of these ecosystems, and it's one of the reasons there's a lot of discussions. Most of these carbon credit ecosystems are not regulated. There are compliance markets, but there is also a huge voluntary carbon market. And so this is one of the best figures that I have found to describe the market because of its relative simplicity of showing these blue bars of the cash payments. But we can sort of start and say, and David really sort of set this up nicely in talking about wetland mitigation. Generally, we need some sort of investors who will pay for these activities, the tree planting, the restoration, the protection of these ecosystems. We might have project developers who would put together and work with landowners to implement these projects. And then remember, we want these things accurately measured, reported, and verified. There's typically third-party auditors in our system that look at these 100-page documents of what was done and how things were measured. Once it's been audited and potentially verified, it goes to a registry or a carbon offset program. And that's the place that actually holds the tickets of those bushels of carbon dioxide, and can sell them then to any number of interested buyers, which could be single corporations or firms, but also carbon brokers or carbon exchanges in this sort of flow of credits through the system. And this is a relatively simple. This is not even close to all the corporate firms that have popped up in the last couple years within this ecosystem. And this comes from a blog by Alex Prather, and you can find actually a bunch of these. And I don't think you need to memorize all these firms because they're constantly popping in and out, but it does make it really challenging to sort of understand who is who in the carbon market, and the flow of where information is coming from. And so with that, I think we can take just a few minutes for questions, but I just want to highlight here within our ecosystem that we have folks who are actively working within the carbon crediting ecosystem. And so they can talk a lot about the application of the science and the ideas and the financing. And so Liz works for City Forest Credits, I guess you'd be up here, which is a registry looking specifically at urban ecosystem carbon credits. And then Travis with the Climate Trust and Nathan with the American Forest Foundation are working a lot on project development, but also finding investors and funders and land managers. And so I sort of put a big square around this space because their firms work within this space, and I'll let them, share a little bit about what they have been doing. Oh, sorry, I did want to say really briefly why I'm here. I forgot I put these slides in. So as Brad said, I'm running a new research program, and we are really centered on bridging application and science and answering questions of folks like you in the room. This is a really messy space, and we've spent about a year working on some of these questions about measuring, reporting, and verifying. So we are currently conducting a review of soil agricultural MRV protocols, where we're saying if you have a bunch of farm fields in Iowa and you run those through a different protocols, how many credits do you get? Unsurprisingly, the answer is you get a different number of bushels of carbon dioxide. And so what we're really interested in is why and where, what's the difference between these standards? We're also working with collaborators at Lawrence Livermore National Lab and scientists around the country looking at negative emissions potentials. And we are leading up a chapter thinking about forests and improved US forest management of how that might draw down more carbon alongside with technological solutions like direct air capture or biomass and carbon capture and storage or soil storage. And we'll have a report coming out later this fall with those collaborators on some of these negative emissions potentials. But what I really want to say is I'll be around through the break today. Would love to chat with you all. Our goal is to make partnerships at the Applied Science Synthesis program. And so, what questions do you have? What should we be working on here? What should we be presenting science and synthesizing science on? And that's what I would love to hear from you all at some point today, or I think my information is in some of the packets. So please reach out and let me know. I also just want to mention that we ran what I thought were really great series through the Yale Forest Forum, which was a public webinar series on carbon markets. Actually, a lot of what I have learned about carbon markets came from all the wonderful speakers that we had invited. And we had one in the fall, what makes a high quality forest carbon credit, really looking at temperate forest carbon markets here in the US. And then this past spring, how can the voluntary carbon market make a meaningful contribution to protecting tropical forests? All of these wonderful seminars by great speakers were all recorded and can be found online at the Yale Forest Forum website. So I encourage you, if you really want to dive deeper, to check those out. And with that, I'm happy to answer any introductory questions, especially probably on the science side, before turning it over to my panelists. And if there aren't any, that's great, because I might be a little over that time.
This is from one of our virtual attendees.
Great.
How can we incentivize states to conserve wetlands?
Oh, well, I think I want to turn that over to either David or one of the panelists to address. So, yeah. Maybe we can come back to that one. Yeah. All right.
Hello, good morning. Jen Elke Farley with Department of Navy again. We have a climate action plan that we put out last year, Climate Action 2030. And we have a very ambitious goal of sequestering an additional 5 million metric tons of CO2e by 2027. And the biggest thing we're struggling with is first understanding our baseline, which we're working on. But the bigger thing we're struggling with is what you talked about is how do we measure and monitor returns from our investments? So I'd just be really interested in any feedback you have on kind of where to start. We've been talking to a lot of people. I think we still don't have, a great model or tool to use. The Department of Defense is actually working on a carbon tool that's going to take a number of years to develop and come out. So we're kind of looking for, interim ways to measure and monitor and our additionality in the interim. So.
Yeah, I will very briefly try to give a couple of thoughts on that, and then hopefully you all in your talk can chat a little bit about in your specific areas of how you approach that. I will say different. So I was really broadly talking about lots of different types of ecosystem management and then measuring carbon. Some things are really well developed. For example, forestry. We've been measuring trees for a really long time. We have systems in place. We can physically see trees, and we have relatively simple algorithms for calculating, the size of a tree and converting that into carbon mass. And so some projects like in the forestry space, the science is there for doing the measurements and feeling confident, and then also being able to scale that. And I think that's been because we use trees for timber products and fiber. We need to know how many trees are on the landscape. That has supported an economy for a really long time. And so a lot of that science is there within the forestry space. If you flip to something like agricultural soil carbon, we do have large scale models that predict over space and time, or project, I will say, over space and time, what could happen with carbon storage in soils and greenhouse gases. But I think those tools are less well developed. And this is where I say I think ecologists have been a little flat-footed because we don't naturally think of ecosystems as just carbon storage buckets. We think of them as something for as a home to biodiversity, or we think more broadly about the biomass. And so different tools have been developed in different places. And so these MRV standards and the science underpinning them are really going to vary depending on the ecosystem and the activity and the project type. As far as baselines go, baselines, especially in the forestry space, have a rough go of it over the past year and a half. But we have a scholar here, Luke Sanford, who's a political scientist who's been working a lot looking at how governance and environmental policies affect behavior. And there's sort of a whole field of study called causal inference statistics, which is all about, the problem with additionality and the problem with baselines is how do you prove that the financial incentive caused someone to do something? And then how do you know what would have happened at that site when you've now chosen path A and you haven't chosen the other path? So you have this sort of unmeasurable counterfactual that we will never know what will have happened in the absence of that credit. But luckily, there's actually a whole body of theory and statistics that other fields, and this is where I say this is like truly interdisciplinary, of how do we do counterfactual baselines, how do we understand them, and then how do we measure them, coming online with like remote sensing data, especially for forests. I think we actually have a lot of tools that we haven't explored because this relatively new interest in surge in doing this across space. And so I think there's going to be generating a lot of ideas. And so the silver lining to all the criticism, if it doesn't totally implode the voluntary carbon market, is that people are now like, oh, we really need to step it up and we really need to figure out what we know and what we don't know and how we can sort of cross across practices. All right. Well, thanks everyone. And I'm going to turn this over to Liz to talk about city forest credits. And you should be the next one.
And start a timer now so I don't go too far over. Oh, no, not mine either. Do you know what to do here? One moment.
Maybe while they're setting that up, one question about the Navy question is, are you trying to just do reporting internally so that you can substantiate claims of having hit that 5 million target? Okay. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think you'll hear some things about how you might go about doing that you could use. But one thing that people should distinguish is, are they trying to make a carbon project which is going to stand up to market scrutiny, right? That is going to generate credits or quantification that's going to be verifiable by a third party, in which case that leads you down a certain set of answers, versus at the end of 5 years, we need to tell a funder or taxpayer that good stuff happened, right? And I'm not trying to imply that the one is less necessarily lower quality than the other, but they just will require fundamentally different approaches.
No, perfect. Thank you. And thank you for the tech support. I should definitely never be the person in charge of that. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, for that really great introduction, setting us up and setting the scene. I'm Liz Johnston. I'm the director at City Forest Credits. And today I'll provide sort of a brief background on our registry, some of the impacts to date, and then kind of an overview of the crediting process and 2 examples. So we are a national nonprofit carbon registry. We provide a new way sort of for private financing sector or private sector dollars to finance high quality tree planting and preservation projects that contribute to the health and well-being of people and the environment. Urban forests, they really stand at an interesting place at the center of carbon removal, but also social equity and public health, biodiversity, and positive community impacts where millions of people live and work. These are really, I would say our overarching goal is also really to provide new access to this revenue stream, but really specifically for long-term maintenance and stewardship funding, specifically for trees. So we make all this possible through urban forest carbon credits. And Sarah gave an example of some of the other carbon registries or programs. And up on the slide, because we are a very specialty carbon registry, we're not usually mentioned, but we're similar in some ways, many ways, to American Carbon Registry, Vera, or Climate Action Reserve, which you probably are familiar with. And most very recently, really in the last 2 weeks, I think we have a press release coming out in the next week or so, we got that international endorsement by ICROA, which is the International Carbon Reduction Offset Alliance. And this is something which will maybe put us on some of those diagrams as other carbon registries, but it's a pretty big deal for us because now we're sort of in that same sort of space. We have this international endorsement, even though it is all voluntary, it makes a big difference to companies that are purchasing credits to know this is a legitimate and vetted carbon registry, not something we just cooked up on the side. We saw an opportunity for carbon credits as really one of the many finance tools that can provide funding for trees. Because companies, as Sarah mentioned, are looking for investment opportunities more and more, they're also looking for ones that are local, credible, and measurable. They're wanting to leverage their carbon or social impact dollars really where it matters most, trust in the standards that are representing these projects, and then being able to report on this data from these high quality projects as well. There's also a really unique aspect of the urban forest carbon credits in that these are projects that are generating credits that are right where people live. So these are not far away where it's very valuable, but harder to understand and less tangible. These are in people's backyards. And I'll also say carbon crediting, it's going to generate long-term funding, but it's equally important that it's going to ensure responsibility, accountability, and reported results. So nationally, we started in 2015, so relatively new. We've grown both in staff. I was the second person hired, and I've now been here for about 4 years, a little over 4 years, but also in the number of registered projects. So currently there's 45 registered projects. About 36 of those have been completed so far with credits issued. As of April of this year, we've issued over 125,000 credits to those projects. It's a relatively small volume in the carbon world, but it's a really big impact for local communities through that carbon revenue. And this last stat, the last bullet point, is a way of trying to describe what that revenue represents. So it's been over $3 million that these local projects have earned through selling their credits. And this is money they didn't have access to otherwise. So it's a $3 million goes a long way. The foundation of our work is really based in the carbon standard and our 2 protocols. These are also thought of as rule books. Some other registries refer to them as methodologies. But what they do is they describe sort of what types of projects can happen, where they can happen, how carbon and co-benefits are quantified, and then also things that all of the projects are expected to have around additionality and permanence, third-party verification, and those types of requirements. We developed these 2 protocols along with an experienced national drafting group, and we have one for tree planting. This is for new trees that has a 26-year time commitment, and one for tree preservation that has a 40-year or a 100-year commitment. This forest preservation protocol is modeled after avoided conversion in forestry. I'll give one example at the end. So, as all carbon credits, regardless of the type of registry or the type of project, are always going to represent 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. It's either going to remove CO2 from the atmosphere or prevent it from being emitted. So we call credits that we issue carbon plus credits. And this is because they are more than just carbon. Kind of think of them as premium credits. You have the carbon, and you also have, being near cities and near people and buildings, the ability to quantify ecosystem benefits as resource units and avoided costs for rainfall interception. So this is important for stormwater management, air quality improvements, and energy savings or efficiencies. And then in the carbon industry, these are all called co-benefits. There's, of course, many other benefits that are not quite as easy to quantify, that are more of a narrative sort of description. And these are things around human health and equity that are also part of each carbon project. So we can report on these to the people leading the projects and how they contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Each project impact is mapped to these SDGs. So this is a diagram that's a little simpler than the one that Sarah showed, but it's also doesn't get all of the nuances of how it works, but it's the high level process. So, we're here in green, we are the registry. Our role is really to maintain that integrity and the quality for each project. A project operator or local operator or project lead is going to plan a project that meets those requirements. My role and my colleagues' role is really to provide that guidance of what those rules are, how they meet them, and then the templates and support along the way. But we don't lead the projects ourselves. That operator is going to plant trees, or they're going to protect forests. And that's the way they show that they've done that then is filling out crediting documentation that meets those requirements. Our information then, or we review that information, we validate it is the phrase that's used, and then we pass it to a third-party verifier that does an independent third check that everything is meeting compliance. Once that verification is complete, and if it's gone well, we issue credits to that project operator. Then that project operator will sell credits to a buyer who can offset their emissions. And the sort of long-term, that 26 or 40-year commitment between us, the registry, and the local operator means that they will submit monitoring reports, other crediting documentation, and we monitor that compliance for the long term. So I, of course, could always go on and on, but I want to give a couple quick examples of what a project actually looks like. So with the planting projects, there's two different types. These are known as afforestation and reforestation. These are new tree plantings. One of the things is the criteria has to be, we have an urban location criteria, which is in a city for sure, but it's also the areas that cities are expanding to. So frequently when we work with land trusts, it might be that urban, peri-urban area where many land trusts are conserving lands, but also it can be a regional planning agency and other places that are planning of what is going to happen next, where people are going to move. So it's not just in cities, but that said, the type of project that happens is going to differ based on the geography. So the scale of these projects is much smaller than those of planting projects in rural areas. But there's three planting designs. So there's single tree planting. This is going to be like a street tree. They're pretty far spaced apart. Somebody can plant 1,000 trees or more in up to 36 months or 3 years. They could choose to have a project be in 1 year, but frequently depending on the season of when planting happens or how many trees a city or a nonprofit can afford to purchase, they can maybe need a few years to put a project together. They're going to track individual tree growth and sample at key years. And there's also clustered or area reforestation projects. These are going to be trees planted closer together. And instead of tracking individual tree survival, the project operator will track and monitor the tree canopy growth over that 26-year timeframe. So one specific example is in the city of Minneapolis. This is a very large project example, but it'll give you a sense of sort of the scale that can be achieved. And in this, a nonprofit called Green Minneapolis is the project operator. So they are the entity taking responsibility for this 26-year commitment. But they're working with the city of Minneapolis, in this case, the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, who owns the land and the trees, and they do the planting and the maintenance. So both the landowner and the project operator or developer are making these long-term commitments. So in this project, they planted, just shy of, well, a little over 23,700 trees over 3 years, which is a huge amount. And they intend to plant about 7,000 or more trees each year and complete an annual project. So they are continuously having an income stream as they are planting these trees, because it is money. Once they sell the credits, they can put back into revenue to take care of these trees, grow their program. They have workforce development programs in place, and all kinds of other things that they have planned. And in this case, for tree planting projects, credits are issued at 5 times over a 26-year period. So these are forward credits or ex-ante crediting. I am happy to answer questions. I don't have a lot of slides about this, but I can answer anything off at the panel or out at the break. But in this case, these are projecting this carbon that the trees will store when they are 25, 26 years old. In this case, this example where I have the money and information at the bottom, they were following a protocol we had where we only had credits issued 4 times. One of the things as part of that ICROA endorsement, to provide lots of examples of ways we could improve our program. And one was to add a 5th year of measurement and verification at year 14. So now all projects in 2023 and onwards have to do that. The last thing I'll just say on this slide before I move to a preservation example is that about 70% of the credits are issued in the first 6 years. And this is really important because people can't wait to the very end to receive money. You need the money right away. In fact, people would probably love to have the revenue before the project even gets started. In this case, they're receiving credits with a little bit of credits, 10% at the beginning, and the primary bulk in years 4 and 6. In this project, over a lifetime of 26 years, credits will probably be sold at different values depending on the buyers in the market. We've increased the examples of what credits could be sold at based on just general forest information and credit trends. But they could be making more than $2.5 million just from this one project alone, which is a huge amount of revenue for a city. And really leverages, I would say, the public investment a lot further by having this come from private dollars. So then quickly, I want to give an example of a preservation project. These are also, I would say, preservation projects have been about 80 to 90% of the credits that we've issued so far. And I think that's because these are ex post credits. They represent, trees that are storing carbon right now. We also have done a lot of work with land trusts, and so this can work really well hand in hand with forest preservation and new acquisitions as a way to pay for that stewardship funding. These are trees that they have to not currently be protected, and they also have to show that there's a threat that these trees would be cut down. And in most cases, because these are in urban or near urban areas, the properties are zoned residential or commercial, sometimes agriculture. And so what is going to be avoided, part of what makes additionality work, is understanding by protecting these trees and keeping them as forest now, what is being avoided? Is it, 5 homes per acre? Is it a huge building, a huge commercial development? And all of that is part of what goes into the carbon quantification. Again, the scale is much smaller than other forest carbon projects. So the minimum acreage to enroll is 15 acres. I think the largest project we've registered has been 235 acres, but primarily the average is around 50 acres. And credits are based on the size of the project. It's got to hurry up. So if it's 50 acres or less, they receive their credits in 1 year. And one of the things that I think I just want to point out briefly here is if the person leading the project operator, wants to credit that additional biomass growth because they're making a 40-year commitment, they can choose to do so, at year 15 or year 20, which provides a new revenue source again at that time. One quick example in Chicago, and I just actually this morning met Ryan and spoke to Ryan. His organization has enrolled a carbon project in the Chicago Region Carbon Program. This is something we've been working on for the past few years, partnering with the Chicago Region Trees Initiative, and they've established a regional carbon program where they'll help recruit cities, land trusts, anyone who wants to start a carbon project, and really provide that, I think, assurance that this is a program that is credible and you can trust that this is a good investment of your time and money and you're taking risks that are appropriate. One example is a land trust we worked with called the Land Conservancy of McHenry County. They acquired a 45-acre property and received about 7,700 credits. And they're selling their credits, I think, this year. And so they'll get about $236,000 in revenue. And that's my last slide, is just about the whole buyers and funders and selling process. Again, I think the whole talk could probably be just about this, but as a registry, we don't sell the credits, but project operators can sell credits directly to companies. They can sell them through a for-profit sort of carbon advisor. Sara mentioned South Pole, that's one. Blue Source, there's quite a few out there now. Or they can sell them altogether. We've had quite a few project operators that have chosen to aggregate their credits and sell them all as one sort of bundle. This was done last year for the first time, and it was all the urban forest carbon credit projects. They sold them to one buyer for $36 per credit, which is a pretty high price compared to many of the other forest carbon credits that we're selling between $10 and $15 per credit. And I will just say, I think there's a lot of different companies out there that are interested for different reasons. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about these credits that I've noticed over the past few years is that companies are willing to spend a lot more because of all of those co-benefits and other things that a company is getting, not just the carbon offset piece of it. So with that, thank you. Happy to answer questions.
Let's do one question for Liz right now while we do tech difficulties over here. And then we'll hopefully have a few minutes at the end too.
Hi, this is Peter Stein asking Liz a question. Liz, could you, you don't have a lot of time to answer it, but could one of the, I think, really important co-benefits that you alluded to was related to water, water storage for extreme storm events, water purification, because that's what trees actually do really well. Could you just touch on that as part of the plus?
Sure, make sure this works. Yes, so I think specifically because these projects are taking place in and near cities, we know there's these stormwater or rainfall interception benefits that the trees are providing. Right now, we use an iTree program that just has the information with a great amount of data sets of other projects. And so we have to know, the number of trees that are being planted, the species, the climate zone. And so we can provide that number in sort of resource unit and cost. It's a fixed number that they put in for as far as the data creation goes, but I think it helps to have an actual set of metrics that people can look at to say, oh, this project of 1,000 trees or 25,000 trees is representing X in a savings. That's as far as we are right now for the data that we can use, but I think there's a lot of things that are interesting happening in the research space that we will hopefully be able to adapt and put into our program, as the peer review and everything else is done.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz, for sharing about urban forest. I'm going to now hand the mic over to Travis Croft, who's going to speak a little bit about the Climate Trust and a grassland ecosystem management portfolio that he is working on. So take it away, Travis.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. It's really great to be here at Conservation Finance Boot Camp. And again, I'm Travis Croft. I work as a senior project analyst at the Climate Trust. And do a little background on TCT. We've been around since 1997, so there's been a good bit of history just in terms of the carbon market and what's changed since then. In 1997, there wasn't much of an offset market or protocols in general. So, and then, we'll jump into kind of focusing on some of the work we've done with avoided conversion of grassland projects and how that program is sort of up and running. Talk about some things there. Have you guys been clicking with this button? Yeah. This one. Okay, sweet. So as I mentioned, we have 25 years of experience. Climate Trust was founded in 1997, and we are a nonprofit organization. We're one of the only carbon project developers that is a nonprofit organization. There's quite a few for-profits in the space. And so that's something we really lean on when we're talking with landowners and developing projects. A big part of our mission is, bringing carbon revenues to communities and to smaller landowners, and making sure that they get the most benefit that they can out of the project. So something I've really appreciated working with, and makes us a little bit different than others developing projects as well. And recently we've really focused on nature-based climate solutions. So improved forest management projects, reforestation is kind of a new realm for us, and then avoided conversion of grasslands, as well as some anaerobic dairy digesters. Those are methane capture projects with sort of lagoons there. Well, that wasn't me that did that. I'll go back here. These bubbles at the bottom are just meant to be a little bit of a timeline on some of the things that we've been involved in and done since 1997. In 2001, we helped pilot some of the early offset standards, which were energy efficiency projects, combined heat power systems, things of that sort. Not so much nature-based back then. 2007, we were a lead author on the Offset Quality Initiative, which kind of sought to bring some guardrails into the market and some guidelines for what a voluntary carbon market might become at that point. And I'll jump forward a little. 2016, I'll talk more about this. We launched a carbon investment fund called Climate Trust Capital, and that really jump-started some of our work with grasslands. We formed a grassland carbon cooperative. And that's going to be kind of the focus of the rest of my talk today. And then slight plug, we were recently awarded funding from the Climate Smart Commodities grant to do reforestation and afforestation projects. And our main goal there is to pair carbon finance with timber revenues. And so providing funding to get trees in the ground targeting areas that were impacted by wildfire or degraded agricultural land in the southeastern United States, doing mostly like longleaf pine plantings there. Moving on to that Climate Trust Capital Fund. This was an effort launched in 2016, so predates my time there, but was a for-profit entity. Climate Trust Capital was sort of set up separately from the Climate Trust, and we really kickstarted it with a $5.5 million loan from the Packard Foundation, which was a PRI that has been repaid, fully invested, and now the projects are generating credits and returns based off of that. So main premise was that carbon offsets are, can be underpriced and a bit of a risky investment in general. So we were really piloting, using this money, looking at forecasted future carbon revenues from 3 different project types, and then providing upfront payments really at kind of the initiation stage of those projects. So the money got deployed into 2 forestry projects, 2 dairy digesters, and then 3 grassland projects. And it was a combination of compliance and voluntary market projects in there. I'll dive in just a little bit more on some of the things that TCT has been involved with over the years. I mentioned in 1997, we got our start through the Oregon CO2 standard. And this was legislation that the state of Oregon adopted that required electricity power plants to reduce their emissions by a certain amount every year. And one way to do that was to set aside money into a fund that would deploy it into emissions reductions projects. That fund essentially became the Climate Trust. And so we were the entity in charge of taking those Oregon dollars and putting them towards projects that could, verifiably reduce emissions. And so that's one of our sort of longstanding programs. We're still involved with that today. That's aside from project development. We're also, sort of in charge of finding good projects to use the Oregon dollars to invest in offset projects or emissions reductions. We've been involved in several conservation innovation grants, SIG grants, and quite a few of them were really related to the grassland. This thing's got a mind of its own. The protocol developments. And so in 2013 and 2015, there was kind of 2 separate pushes there. As well as in 2015, the Working Lands Carbon Fund was another SIG grant that really supported our efforts to develop the Climate Trust Capital Fund. So those kind of happened in conjunction. We were also involved in a nitrogen fertilizer use efficiency project, and that's working with farmers to make sure that they apply the right type of fertilizer at the right time and reducing nutrient runoff, and ultimately N2O volatilization from that. We're also a developer of improved forest management projects. Those are pretty noteworthy in the carbon market, both voluntary and compliance. Mentioned the grasslands conservation sort of through carbon-based financing. And then that Climate Smart Commodities grant really is going to be one of the next undertakings for us for the next 5 years or so. So we're really at the beginning stages of that, but would be happy to chat more. I know there's a few others too with funding under that grant opportunity. So a little history on the avoided conversion of grasslands, and Indy Burke's talk last night, the few last slides that she presented really drove this home. But in terms of, how does this set itself up in the carbon market, developing the protocol was a clear first thing that needed to happen. So starting in 2010 with kind of a variety of groups involved, Ducks Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, and the Climate Trust. We're all involved in writing the first avoided conversion of grasslands protocol. And that was originally adopted by the American Carbon Registry in 2013. Ducks Unlimited was the primary project developer on that one. And the first round of credits that was issued was purchased by Chevrolet. In 2015, a little more work was done. Another SIG grant. We weren't the direct awardee, but a partner on it, with working with the Climate Action Reserve, this time another carbon registry to sort of develop and eventually update their, sorry, I'm not sure why, happening, grasslands protocol. And so there are differences between the American Carbon Registry one and the Climate Action Reserve one. So I'd be happy to talk a bit about that. And, through those years, the pilot projects kind of through TCT, Ducks Unlimited, and Environmental Defense Fund really set up kind of the infrastructure that's needed to roll out more projects and ultimately scale this work. So this is kind of our case study, the Zumwalt Prairie Carbon Cooperative. This is the 3 grassland projects that I mentioned earlier that the Climate Trust Capital Fund was able to invest in. And so we provided upfront payments for the placement of 3 conservation easements on a total of 22,000 acres of working ranch land. And this part of the Zumwalt Prairies in eastern Oregon, all 3 of these ranches were adjacent to each other, so pretty large contiguous patch of 22,000 acres. And each ranch had different amounts of acres that were ultimately eligible for the carbon project, but in general, around 25 to 50% of the ALE funding is what we were able to provide with our upfront investment there. And we did develop the project as a cooperative. That is an approach we've used to try to reduce the cost of project development. With the avoided conversion of grassland projects, the most expensive component of it tends to be the verification. And so by including all 3 ranches in one cooperative, we were able to then verify the projects sort of simultaneously and issue credits in one batch, which also had benefits for ultimately marketing and selling the credits to end buyers. The upfront payments that were made were based on the first 10 years of projected carbon revenues. So, again, looking forward into how many credits did we think each project would generate, and then basing our kind of upfront investment amounts on that. We now look at more of a 20-year term in general, and that has to do with the baseline calculations for the avoided conversion project. It models the loss of soil carbon over time, and so it's actually saying if you were to farm this land, how much soil carbon would you release each year? And Indy pointed this out also in her slides last night that the soil carbon that takes thousands of years to sequester can be released within the first few decades of farming. So the issuance of offset credits really does decline over time as kind of per that model there. And so with these projects, the Climate Trust capital, the upfront investment was repaid first through the sale of carbon offsets, and then a revenue share was started between CTC and the landowner. And the easements for this project were held by the Nature Conservancy. There's a nice picture from TNC of the Zumwalt Prairie. In terms of selling the credits, Climate Trust, we've been around for a while, so we do have some long-term relationships with end buyers. The grassland credits are all in the voluntary market, so corporate companies that are looking to reduce their emissions are interested in these credits. We've also seen them kind of be paired in a portfolio approach. Some buyers are looking at that. They'll buy several different types of credits. And in terms of carbon offset projects, the grasslands tend to generate a pretty small volume overall. So they're kind of sufficiently unique. There's not a lot of grassland credits available in the voluntary market. So we've seen kind of a paired approach there. And as Liz kind of pointed out as well with some of the urban tree planting projects, these projects as well have a lot of really good co-benefits, ecosystem services they're providing, lots of biodiversity. And I really love the sort of habitat connectivity piece here too, with 22,000 acres of contiguous land being conserved. And the primary thing with these projects is the placement of the easement. So, this land is being protected in perpetuity. That's, the conservation easement in a lot of ways is the carbon project. And then the Climate Trust, really our role in the process is to handle all of the carbon project development, making sure it adheres to the protocol, managing the verification, and then marketing and selling the credits on behalf of the landowner. So that Zumwalt Prairie example in the Climate Trust Capital Fund really, is an example of a new source of finance for conservation easements. And so using that approach of forecasted carbon revenues to provide an upfront payment for the placement of the easement is something that the Climate Trust is really excited about and kind of the basis of the program that we are rolling out. And I think I mentioned this in a lot of ways, that upfront payment is used as the required match of NRCS ALE funding when easements are coming into fruition. So that's generally the way that it's worked now. We do foresee and in some ways hope to eventually be able to solely fund conservation easements based on carbon dollars. We are definitely not there yet, but as the price of carbon credits increases, we're able to provide more per acre and things like that. So that's maybe like a long-winded goal that we hope to maybe see happen sometime. The funding structures are between, like I mentioned, the Climate Trust, the Land Trust is the easement holder, and the landowner. As a nonprofit, we really try to give landowners the option to have market upside as much as they want to. Some landowners do want to, in some ways, de-risk the project by securing, forward sales and end buyers who are guaranteeing to purchase credits at a set price. We also, try to talk with landowners and say, hey, in the last 5 years, the price of these grassland carbon credits has basically doubled. And so there is a lot of market upside available for landowners, and we want to be able to give them that. It is always a risk though. Premise here is protecting all that pre-existing soil carbon. Again, the sequestration component of the grasses themselves and the standing biomass is certainly important. Thank you. But really there's a huge store of carbon in the soils pre-existing, and it takes so long to sequester that. So these projects are really great protecting those things. And again, we focus mainly on the Climate Action Reserve's grassland protocol, which is the avoided emissions, and uses kind of a standardized calculation approach to determine eligibility, things like that. So our grassland program, try to speed it up here a little bit. So far, we've got 8 active projects that encompass 70,000 acres under conservation easements. Those have issued 49,000 offsets so far, and all of those have been sold to end buyers. And so the crediting period, the project can generate credits for up to 50 years. So in total, that's about 400,000 tons of avoided emissions. And looking forward, we've got another 200,000 acres or so in our project pipeline across the US and Canadian Great Plains that we're looking to, partner with land trusts to develop more projects. Quick picture. I took this during a site visit last September when we were in Montana. I think it just really captures. I was pretty struck by, how vast these grassland ecosystems can be. And, there is so much wildlife and biodiversity components that are involved with them, and protecting them really is important. So in this case, actually, it was a really lovely sunset evening, and the landowner could not stop apologizing by how poorly he thought the land looked, because it was a really dry year. And we kind of came in the fall. And so, it really struck home to me that these landowners, they are the stewards of the land, absolutely. And they are out there every single day running their cattle, and they care about the grass so much. So it's been really rewarding to be able to work with them, get out, and then, make carbon offsets an additional revenue stream for them. Quick recap here, carbon-based finance, it can be a driver of grassland conservation. And I think that's kind of the main thing that I wanted to talk about today with these. They are kind of unique credits, and we have been able to receive a premium price for them. And working with good project partners and all of that can really make the process run smoothly.
Great. Thanks so much, Travis. While we're getting set up for our last speaker, does anyone have one question for Travis?
No questions. Okay. Oh, good. Will's taking us.
And I can get started. Well,
Perfect.
it's already
All right. So Nathan Truitt is going to take us home talking about the American Forest Foundation.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have the advantage of going after people have described specific carbon projects. So I'm actually going to skip that part of what I was going to talk about. How this thing makes for? Okay, sorry. Technology, hard for me. What I want to talk to you about today is why carbon markets? Why should you all care about this, right? Why specifically you as conservation finance professionals should, indeed, I would argue, must play a role in this. And the way I'm going to do this also is the way to explain the American Forest Foundation, our transformation from an organization which 5 years ago had 1/2 of an FTE devoted to trying to figure out carbon, to today, which is exclusively focused on carbon markets with over 100 employees working on it. Okay, it goes like this. So I've had a lot of conversations to sort of bring people along internally. So I want you all to think about the project that you've, or your organization has implemented that you're the most proud of. Okay, so imagine it, actually try and get out there in the woods or the grasslands or wherever. If we don't mitigate climate change, right, the effects of climate change, that project will be destroyed. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that's just the fact, right? So we start with that. Nothing that we do will matter if we don't mitigate climate change. So that's fact number one. Fact number two, there is no scenario produced by the IPCC, none, not one of the hundreds of scenarios they have produced, which holds us to less than 2 degrees warming without the large scale activation of natural climate solutions at a scale at least 10 times the way they're currently being used. That's number 2. And number 3, there is no mechanism aside from magical thinking to finance natural climate solutions at that scale other than carbon markets. By the way, I'm going to ditch the voluntary carbon markets because they're voluntary in the same way that your existence is voluntary, right? Like we either will fix them and therefore we will get to survive as a society or we won't. Okay, so this is why you all should be working on carbon projects, either developing them yourself, figuring out how to align your work with them, or figuring out how to support them, right? Because their successful functioning is necessary for all the things that you're working on. Okay. Second thing, so that's sort of the scary bad news. You all have a unique role to play because at the beating heart of all the problems with carbon markets are actually finance problems, right? That you are uniquely positioned to solve. There's really 2 problems with carbon markets. One is just human problems, right? So like all these terms that we're throwing at you and all the complexities and how are we going to treat this and how are we going to do that. To tell you the truth, if any 5 of us locked ourselves in a room for one day, we could come out of there with the answers. Like they're not that complicated. It's the science of forestry, which we've known how to do for over 100 years, and it's the science of statistics. That's it. Like remote sensing, yes, it will help. Will we learn new things? Sure, but we have all the knowledge to make these things work. The problem is there's 8,000 people around the world who have really strong opinions and they all come with an agenda, right? So they don't just want climate mitigation. They want climate mitigation that also does these other things, right? And so that's what causes this. And the second problem is finance. So the rest of the presentation, I just want to walk you through a case study of what I'm talking about. You can get all these slides and all my lovely writings if you would like. Really quickly about FFCP. Okay, so we started in 2020. It's a collaboration between AFF and the Nature Conservancy. We visited about 1,400 landowners with 250,000 acres, and we've signed up at this point about 60,000 acres. Those landowners, through the course of their contracts, will generate about 2 million tons of climate mitigation. That is about 1/500th of the amount of land that we need to enroll in this program or a program like it by 2030 to do our part. Let me say that again. It is 1/500th of what we all need to enroll in order to do our part for climate mitigation. The date today is June 6th, 2023. So it's not enough to say sense of urgency, right? We have got to stop making the perfect the enemy of the good and figure out how to get this work on the ground. Okay, here's the case study I wanted to talk about. You've heard a lot about like quality concerns, and you've watched John Oliver, which was hilarious. Here's a solution to quality concerns. A dynamic baseline, right? It's about this issue of additionality. So what is a dynamic baseline? Let me explain it really quickly. So Susan, if I'm developing a vaccine and I'm going to give you a vaccine as part of a test, what do I want to know? I want to know, will the vaccine prevent you from getting a disease? Here's the problem. When I give you the vaccine, the universe in which you didn't get the vaccine ceases to exist. I can never go there, right? So it is metaphysically impossible for me to know the answer to the question I want to know. So what do we do with that? Well, what we do is we recruit a whole bunch of people who look like Susan, same age, same characteristics, same background, same socioeconomic status. We put them into 2 groups. Some get the vaccine, some don't. We track the results. We've isolated a variable. Again, this is something that's been known for a long time. We can do the same thing with forest carbon projects, right? We can have our project scenario where we're monitoring what happens under our project, and we can match it to other plots, either from forest inventories or increasingly from remote sensing, in order to isolate that variable and to demonstrate strong correlation, never causation, but it suggests causation between the project and the outcome. Okay, this sounds great, right? Did it, boom, right? This is an example. We've solved the quality problems. Now, however, carbon markets are a game of whack-a-mole, and this is where you all come in. So, okay, we were all told additionality is a concern, right? So we're smacking additionality, it goes down, but something else comes up. This is the financial model for the family forest carbon program at scale. This is like cumulative operating revenues. Yes, I'm glad people are whistling. First of all, if anyone knows a donor who can write me a check for $413 million, I've got like 50 million tons of carbon mitigation that I can give them, which is a pretty good idea, you know, a pretty good deal. But probably no one knows that donor. So how are we going to finance this? Here is the real difficulty in financing this. And by the way, this is driven by large upfront costs in landowner recruitment, incentive payments, the payments of the practices themselves. And those generate carbon credits only over time. When I sign up a landowner, best case scenario, it is 72 months until I'm able to monetize the value of the carbon that they're storing. Best case scenario. And that's just a portion of the carbon that they'll store over that contract, right? Now, remember the dynamic baseline, right? That sounds really good, right? Oh, we solved that. Only here's the thing. So I'm paying the people to take the vaccine, but I have no control whatsoever about what happens in the baseline scenario. There could be fires, there could be changes in timber markets, could be changes in regulation, there could be changes from the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which causes a plant response, right? All of that can affect the baseline, meaning I cannot predict how many carbon credits my project is going to generate. I can spend a lot of time building super complicated models. I cannot predict it. So when I walk into an investor and I show this graph by itself is tough, but it's not necessarily a problem because there's tons of green on the right side of this graph that we could use to fill the hole. Here's the problem. They go, this looks great. And of course, this is secure and sure and all that. And I go, no, it is highly risky. There are many sources of risk. The market itself is variable. And by the way, our own methodology is highly variable. And that investor says, the security will show you to the door, right? So this is where we need to innovate, right? We need the finance brains to figure out how are we going to share risk amongst the different actors in a carbon project in an efficient way, in a way that really hasn't been done, right, in this sort of sphere. This is why your skill sets are critical to unlocking this market. Because if we don't have that, if we can't come up with new solutions to do that, we will either have low quality carbon projects, right, that basically fix this problem by creating false certainty around dynamic natural systems, or we will have high quality carbon projects that can attract nowhere near the amount of capital they need to be successful. So with that, and realizing that breaks are like the most useful thing at these sort of events, so I don't want to eat into them, I will go ahead and stop.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for taking us home and your flexibility. Sorry that I started the eating up your time chain. We do have a few minutes for questions now, but as Nathan said, the break is right after. And so hopefully you can go pepper folks who are up here with specific questions about all the amazing stuff. And we can start back there.
Thank you. Saraya here from Blue Forest. I'm a little nervous to answer this question, but I remember yesterday we were encouraged to ask the most baseline of questions. So I guess I'm curious how, because it sounds like with carbon markets, a huge focus is just in the protection of lands or the, I don't know the word that was used, the avoidance of, okay. So I guess my question there is, how at risk are some of these lands that we are protecting for the purpose of avoiding emissions? Like how likely is it that by putting forth this capital that we're actually avoiding something and not just kind of like in a loop of just like throwing funds? I definitely understand for urban areas, right? It's where it's like at high risk for development, but yeah, I guess my question is just about, while in the restoration, and I totally understand like landscape in a tough spot, you know, I definitely see that arc of like improvement for carbon, but yeah, for existing lands where there's not any specific activities being done to change the carbon situation there, how impactful is this? But not in a way that I'm not trying to be offensive to you.
You're from Blue Forest Conservation?
Yes.
Okay, so let's use your work as an example,
Okay.
right? And this, I'm going to use this as another example of what I was just talking about. So there's actually two answers, right? We could go and we could say, this piece of land will probably suffer catastrophic wildfire during the project scenario, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say the baseline is catastrophic wildfire. And we're going to say our hazardous fuel reduction project is the project scenario. Now, what would be the benefit of that? I can monetize a ton of credits on day one, right? Because it will show that like, this is all going to burn down. And by doing this, we're not. And I'll be able to predict exactly how many credits I'm going to produce, right? Is it in fact the case that every piece of forested land in the West is going to suffer catastrophic wildfire? Of course not. So that is a low quality carbon project that is really easy to implement, right? Okay, the high quality one would be something like a dynamic baseline, where we would try and select a reference area similar to the project area across a number of covariates. And we would take the risk that if we do this project and the reference area doesn't suffer fire, which by the way is a good thing, right? Like you never want to be in a situation where you're sitting there going like, please let there be a catastrophic wildfire in the reference area. Then this project would have generated 0 carbon credits, right? So who's going to bear that risk? Right now, the market says the project developer will bear that risk. But who are project developers? It's like nonprofits, small startups. I mean, our ability to bear risk is very, very tiny. So I know I didn't give you an exact answer to that question, but I just wanted to illustrate like there are different ways of answering it that drive you towards different financial and quality outcomes. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I appreciate it.
And can I just jump in here? That was great, Nathan. I think also we think of a lot of these metrics like additionality as binary, that it either is or it isn't. And that is like not like as I don't know anything about finances, but you all understand risk, and it's not risky or not risky. It's like along a continuum. And so I think we need to think about additionality or permanence along a continuum of a probability of risk, and the dynamic baselines help us hit that a little bit more of estimating that difference. And that I think is a really important narrative to push out. The other thing is, I think it's why we need to scale. If you're just going to save 10 acres of grassland, you might hit jackpot or you might not. But if you're saving hundreds of thousands of acres of grassland, you're definitely getting additional credits, because we know there's development pressure on these lands. And so I think that's like the bigger risk is we got to scale, and we got to scale fast if we want to hit these. And yes, some are going to be duds, but sometimes we invest in things that are duds, and that's okay as long as we're maintaining this bigger portfolio.
Hi, Carrie Kesnica from the Trust for Public Land. Thank you so much for everything you're doing. It's one more tool for us to work with landowners. Working in Texas, 96% of the land is privately owned. So you're going to be working with these landowners. You have to make it make sense. It has to be predictable. It has to be pragmatic. And I think the only entity that might have less risk tolerance than you is a rancher. You know, the line between a really good year and a catastrophic year is very tiny. So I want this to be in my tool bag, and I don't feel comfortable with where it's at right now. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit. The average ranch in Texas is 411 acres. There's a lot of ranch land, but it's 400 acres. To me, that is not a scaled project that's going to make a whole lot of sense. How can we make this make sense for these landowners? Like they are such an integral part in that area of the country. You're not moving that needle at all if you're not working with landowners. So can you help us figure out how to make it make sense and just see, you know, especially if it's grassland, which might have a little bit of some variability depending on what kind of grass. Thanks.
Yeah, I can hop on that one. We are working with some ranchers in South Texas, actually. And, you know, one of the goals is to be able to work with smaller landowners. You know, in my opinion, 400 acres isn't all that small either, but in terms of the scale of the projects that we're looking at, it is. And so right now for us with the grassland projects, we have a generally 1,000-acre minimum. And as I mentioned with the case study, we have tried the cooperative approach where we kind of group projects together, and that helps lower the cost of verification. The tricky thing with the grassland project specifically is that it has to be a conservation easement in each case. And so, landowner by landowner, that looks very different. And so there isn't a great umbrella approach per se. And so a lot of ways, even if we have a cooperative, we're really dealing with multiple individual projects that eat up a lot of time and energy to develop. So something we're definitely trying to crack. And, if the prices of carbon credits continue to increase, then smaller and smaller projects will become more feasible. Yeah.
Do you feel comfortable saying like this landowner got this payment? Like they look at us and say, NRCS might feel like you're giving birth trying to get through it. And you're just like, you're talking them off the ledge for like 2.5 years. Like just, you're going to get there. We're going to help you. But I can say you're going to get $2.7 million on this day. And this is what you can do with it. And these are your tax benefits. And these are like, what did those landowners, like what were their payments?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take it from this approach.
Thank you.
For a good project with the avoided conversion, we would generate about 1 carbon offset credit per acre per year. And as I mentioned, that baseline does cause the credit generation to decline over time. So we find that the projects are really only worth the time for years 1 through 20. And then after that, there's such a small amount of credit generation. With 1 carbon credit per acre per year, we've seen, prices for those ranging from $20 to $30 right now. And so, depending on the size of the ranch, obviously the payment is kind of skewed accordingly.